Okay, so we'll look at two themes today, two themes that I think link pretty well, and that's the class divide and capitalism versus socialism. Now, I think these are really important in the play because the class divide does definitely link to socialism and the sort of rise of socialism that happened in England, in the UK after the Second World War. And obviously Priestley is writing this sort of after the Second World War. It's first performed in 1946, which means that people are very, very aware of how socialism is changing things, okay, and how the society that they live in is changing because of socialism. So the class divide and capitalism versus socialism link very, very well together, because the whole point of socialism is that it makes that class divide much smaller. Okay, the point of socialism is to increase like social mobility. So for example, if you work hard enough, if you get a good education, then you are able to get a job that might be above your class. So you could be born to a working class family, but because of the investments in education and a benefit system, etc., you have the means to stay in education for longer, and then you might get a middle class job when you get older. So that's what social mobility is. That's the point of social mobility. So here, when it comes to the class divide and capitalism versus socialism, they link very, very well, because Priestley is trying to say that capitalism is wrong because he believes that it creates a much wider class divide. So the first thing that I want to look at is the quotation, "You mustn't try to build up a wall between us and that girl." Now, the wall is a metaphor, and the wall is a metaphor for the class divide. So it's that idea of separating people. And that's what Mrs. Burling tries to do. She tries to consistently separate herself from Eva. That's Mrs. Burling's opinion on the differences between her and Eva. She sees them as very, very separate, two very distinct people. Again, remember when she says girls of that class, she was putting on ridiculous airs. She sees Eva as very much below her, and she tries to build up a wall to separate them, and that's what the wall symbolizes. That's the metaphor that's here. Now, this is really, really interesting when you consider the fact that Eva wasn't actually that separate from Mrs. Burling, because that's what the inspector was trying to point out. Your son is sleeping with these lower class women. He's affecting their lives. He's getting them pregnant. So actually, there's that sort of irony there that she's trying to build up a wall to separate them, but the girl has already sort of penetrated all the parts of Mrs. Burling's life. She's been involved with everyone in that house, including Mrs. Burling. Now, this quotation is a good one to look at when it comes to the inspector, who actually says we are all members of one body. And I know I've gone over that metaphor before, and I really, really like that metaphor because it's an important one. So the metaphor, we are members of one body, we are responsible for each other, it does again show us that idea that you have to take care of every part of society in order for society to function. That is the metaphor. Now, we are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. That directly contrasts to the attitudes that Mrs. Burling is presenting, and that's why Sheila has to say this. So we can see here where Sheila is very, very similar to the inspector. She becomes very similar to the inspector. So again, I think that's showing us again the idea that Sheila is very aware of the class divide. And as the inspector comes in and sort of opens her eyes to these issues, she changes and she has that redemptive story arc. She deserves redemption by the end. We know she did something horrible and jealous and mean, but we want her to be redeemed at the end. We forgive her at the end. Now, again, so we've got that idea of separating people, but we've also, again, got that simile, like bees in a hive, just here. So it's a simile, obviously, because it uses like. Now, when Mr. Burling says this again in terms of the class divide. He is doing the same thing that Mrs. Burling is trying to do, which is to separate everyone out. He's saying we're not working together. We're not like bees in a hive. We aren't all equal, okay? And again, he's trying to say here that we shouldn't be working together. And that's really symbolic of that idea of I am the upper class, you are the lower class, you work for me. I don't work with you, okay? And that, again, that's not what society was like at the time. The class divide was a very difficult situation. Income taxes actually went up during the wars. And so again, people had a lot less money. And you've got to think of these big business owners, you know, they're losing employees, they're losing, if people have less money, they're buying less. So actually, no one is doing particularly well financially in the wars. So again, it's sort of Mr. Burling believing that he is going to be very prosperous, and it's Priestley sort of pointing out here that he's very silly, and he believes in this class divide that actually shouldn't really exist. Now, the last quotation from this one is, naturally, that was one of the things that prejudiced me against her case. Now, one of the things I quite like here is this sort of adverb, naturally, because I think it's quite interesting that she says, naturally, I was prejudiced against her. So this idea that Mrs. Burling believes prejudice towards the lower class is natural to her shows us again that she thinks that the class divide is something that is set in stone. It is natural to humanity. It is something that we must sort of acknowledge. So I think that's interesting, because again, we're saying naturally that was one of the things that prejudiced me against her case. Naturally, I'm against the lower classes, but it's not natural, is it? Because if it was natural, then why would Sheila change so much? Why would Sheila contrast her mother so much? So that's why I find it incredibly interesting that that Mrs. Burling seems to think that this is natural, but Sheila doesn't. So again, there's so much contrast between their characters that it makes it a really interesting sort of essay and sort of idea to explore here. So then I think this links a lot of the time to socialism versus capitalism and the way they treated the working class in order to make that profit as capitalists. So obviously Priestley was a socialist, and he's writing about the dangers of capitalism. So in his opinion, he believes that the capitalists are using the working class in order to maximize their profit without actually a care for the working class. So I've used again the idea of working together for lower costs and higher prices, and I do analyze that in one of my other videos about the idea of gap and about that idea of where the profit comes in. So, you know, lower costs means more profit, right? Lower costs and higher prices means the gap between my two fingers there, that's the profit. You're going to make more profit, aren't you? So this is again Mr. Burling showing that sort of kind of capitalist that capitalist view. Now I didn't put it because I only had room for 4 quotations, so I didn't put it in here, but it's always a good one to sort of remember when Eric says, why shouldn't they try for higher wages, we try for the highest possible prices, showing that idea that Eric actually has kind of like a socialist, he has some socialist impressions from the very beginning of the play. So again, that idea, you know, the younger generation, they're changing a little bit more, you know, they're the future of this country. And people like Eric, in 1912, he's in his 20s, but actually in 1946, when Priestley was writing, Eric could be about the same age as Priestley himself. Eric could be at the age where he would be making these decisions. You know, he would be a man of society. He would have worked for decades if he survived the war, that he probably would have gone to, but he would have worked for decades, and he would be the type of person, as an upper class man, who'd be making these laws, who'd be, you know, changing things for the better, according to Priestley, for socialism. Now, another person who again shows this underlying socialism is Sheila, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. And again, I've said this before, and I said it in my last, I analysed that quotation in my last video. But this is important again because it shows that Sheila has that socialist underpinning as well. She is very much a socialist from the beginning, but she just hasn't really been allowed to come out of her shell. She's been so badly influenced by her parents that she doesn't express these socialist ideas very often. Or if she does, they get shut down because they really infantilize her. They dismiss her as a child or a young unmarried woman, as they call her a few times. So then the next one is very emotive. Okay, there's quite a lot of emotive language here. The inspector actually talks about the need, he's trying to highlight the need for socialism. So these two quotations show us how badly they have been treated, and then this quotation gives us sort of more of an emotional level. So no work, no money coming in, and living in lodgings with no relatives to help her. Lonely, half-starved, she was feeling desperate. So again, we're looking at the list here. So he lists a lot of tragic situations here, and there's a point to that. He's trying to get us to have that emotive response as an audience. We're meant to feel sorry for the character of Eva because again, she's just been turned out and turned down, that's another quotation, so many times, and she's been so abused. So again, we're looking at adjectives like lonely, starved. Okay, those are the adjectives that are really, really emotive here. They're showing us that idea that the working class, without socialism, they were suffering physically, they were suffering mentally and emotionally as well by being with the adjective lonely. And these are all things that you would sort of say as well. We're getting this financial side of the way they're treated, but now we're getting this emotional side of the way they're treated. And the last one for this one is public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. Now, I like the contrast here. A privilege is obviously something that you gain that's very, beneficial to you. So Mr. Burling, he benefits because he gets to tell people he's Lord Mayor and he gets to throw his status around. Whereas the inspector is pointing out that on the other side of that, on the contrasting side, you have a responsibility as well. Now, responsibilities are obviously things that are quite, that can make your life more difficult. They aren't the same as privileges. They contrast privileges quite a lot. They mean that you have to do things and you have a duty to do things. Now, Mr. Burling doesn't seem to fulfill that duty. He likes the status of being Lord Mayor, but look at when he says community and all that nonsense. He throws around this title of Lord Mayor, but he isn't actually a community man. He doesn't do anything to benefit other people. He does things to benefit himself. So, again, there's that contrast. Public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. Mr. Burling needs to realize here that he has to be responsible for others. Now, the reason this links to socialism versus capitalism, and again, remember at the end of every paragraph you do, you have to link it back to the focus of the question. The reason that this links to capitalism versus socialism is because what Priestley is trying to say is that socialism is about taking those responsibilities for everyone else and isn't just about abusing our privileges. So that's what he believes the capitalists have done. And this is where you bring in your context. He believes the capitalists have done this because the idea of capitalism means that a lot of the working classes suffered. They suffered very much during the war. There were a lot more financial hardships during the war for everyone because we were a capitalist system that was relying solely on profit and exploiting the working classes. But then when a lot of the working class men died at war, because most of the young soldiers or the privates were young working class men, when these working class men died at war, you know, where did it get us? So that's really what Priestley is trying to say here. You know, we relied on capitalism so much, we didn't have a workforce anymore. And what happened? We became socialists. So he's saying here, socialism was the way forward. And that's in his opinion, that's what he believes as a playwright. So these again are two very, very interesting themes to look at. And what you'll notice is, yes, a lot of these quotations come up a few times, but because I knew that the quotations were here, and because I knew them off by heart, I was actually able to kind of dip into them. So I used the one word quote nonsense to talk about this idea of responsibilities and privileges. So what you'll notice is actually, if you use a lot of these, then you'll notice that actually you'll just start kind of picking up where you can weave them into your essay in other places. Okay.